Welcome to the History Maps podcast. For this deep dive, part of our Mesoamerica history series, we are setting out on a comprehensive exploration of the Inca Army.
Right, and it is a massive topic.
It really is.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to unpack a massive logistical and military puzzle. We are going to look at how the Inca, starting from this small polity in the Andean highlands in the 13th century, somehow built and managed an empire of 10 to 15 million people.
10 to 15 million. I mean, just the scale of that is difficult to process.
Yeah, completely. We will examine the mechanics of their massive military, the unique battlefield tactics, the cosmological beliefs that drove them, and, well, their eventual clash with the Spanish in the 16th century.
Which is a collision of two entirely different worlds of warfare.
Exactly. So if you want to know how an empire of this scale actually functioned on the ground, the mechanics of how it moved, fed, and fought, you're in the right place.
To really grasp that scale, we have to look past just the battles themselves. We have to examine the machinery underneath it all.
Right.
I mean, we are talking about a society operating across some of the most unforgiving microterrains on Earth. Deep ravines, sheer vertical drops, high-altitude deserts.
And doing all of that without the wheel.
Exactly. Without the wheel, without iron, and without a written language in the way we traditionally define it. Yet, they fielded armies that were vastly larger and logistically more complex than European forces of the same period.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how the Inca conquered such a vast territory, we first have to look at how they built their army.
Which was completely different from what we might expect.
Right, because if a modern nation wants an army, they generally rely on a volunteer force or maybe a selective service draft in a crisis. But the Inca approached this differently.
They really did. They didn't rely on volunteers at all. And they didn't maintain a massive standing army of full-time commoner soldiers during peacetime either.
So where did the troops come from?
They fueled their military machine through a mandatory public service draft. The term for this labor tax in the sources is the mita.
A labor tax, meaning instead of, paying a portion of your crops or your currency to the state, you paid with your physical time and sweat.
That's the core mechanism, yeah. As the Inca state expanded and absorbed new territories, those conquered peoples were just integrated right into the system.
So they were building the roads and farming the lands as well as fighting.
Exactly. The MITA covered all state projects, but the military aspect of it was heavily formalized. So 1 in every 50 men over the age of 25 was selected for military service.
1 in 50. And from the sources we were looking at, this was not a short tour of duty, right?
No, not at all. They served for a considerable portion of their adult lives.
Like sometimes 6 or 7 years, remaining eligible for the draft until they reached the age of 50.
Which meant the bulk of the Inca army at any given time was multi-ethnic. It was primarily composed of non-Inca conquered peoples serving their rotational duty to the state.
I want to pause on the practical realities of that. Because if you pull 1 in 50 men from an agrarian society for years at a time...
Who is farming the land?
Exactly. The community back home would collapse if they lost that much of their workforce.
Right, but the state anticipated that. The mito was highly communal. When a man was drafted into the army, his local community was legally obligated to tend his fields.
So they took care of his family in his absence.
They had to. The state ensured that military service didn't result in local economic ruin.
That makes sense.
But the recruitment was also highly pragmatic regarding geography. For example, men from the coastal regions were generally exempt from this military service.
That makes perfect physiological sense, actually. If you pull a farmer from sea level and march him up to an altitude of 4,000 meters, he is going to suffer from hypoxia.
His heart rate will skyrocket.
Right. He will be fatigued, and he will likely develop altitude sickness. If your body is adapted to the thick air of the coast, you are just a massive liability on a mountain battlefield.
The Inca administrators understood that environmental adaptation intuitively. They needed soldiers who could march, carry heavy loads, and fight in the thin air.
Because that's where the majority of their campaigns took place.
Exactly. So they drew their military manpower heavily from the highland populations, and through this highly regulated system, the numbers grew to immense proportions.
Like, how big are we talking?
By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, during the reign of leaders like Huayna Capac, a single field army could swell to 200,000 men.
200,000. I mean, to organize a force that large, you cannot just point at a valley and tell a mob to charge. You need a deeply structured chain of command.
You absolutely do.
When I look at the way they broke down their units, it feels incredibly similar to a modern military organization. Today we have squads of 10 to 12 soldiers, a few squads make a platoon, and so on.
Up to battalions and regiments, yeah.
Right. The Inca used a very similar concept, but they organized everything strictly by tens. It was a pure decimal system.
It provided an elegant administrative framework. At the base level, you had 10 men led by an officer known as a chunka kamayuk.
Which functions much like a modern sergeant or a squad leader.
Yes, exactly. And from there, it just scales up mathematically. You have a pachak kamayuk leading 100 men.
A Waranka Kamayuk commanding 1,000.
Right. This structure scales all the way up to an unu, a major general commanding 10,000 men.
And the entire combined army was overseen by an apukispe, which is the equivalent of a field marshal.
What's fascinating here is how the Inca solved a major internal problem with this setup.
You mean the ethnic divisions?
Yes, because if you have an army made up of conquered peoples men who might have been fighting the Inca state just a generation prior, how do you prevent a mutiny?
Right. A multi-ethnic, multilingual, drafted army seems like a recipe for a massive rebellion.
Well, they solved that exact problem by tapping into a philosophical concept deeply rooted in the broader Andean worldview. They didn't try to erase ethnic identities.
You manipulated them.
Exactly, through a concept of duality. In the Quechua language, this duality is expressed as Hanan and Hurin.
Meaning upper and lower, or right and left.
It represents two halves of a whole. It's a complementary but competitive relationship found throughout their society, from city planning to family structures.
So how did that apply to the drafted units?
Each specific ethnic group drafted into the army did not form one massive block. They were divided to form two separate battalions.
One Hanan, one Huron.
Yes. And each of those two battalions was led by its own general, but both reported to a single local warlord known as a curaca who was of their own ethnicity.
Oh, I see.
The Inca administrators deliberately fostered a fierce, intense competition between these two battalions. Promotion for the generals and privileges for the men were based directly on bravery and performance on the battlefield relative to their sister battalion.
That is a brilliant psychological pivot. Instead of an ethnic group uniting in solidarity to rebel against the overarching Inca authority, they are locked in a bitter rivalry with their own neighbors.
They are competing for state glory.
Right. It takes the latent energy of a potential rebellion and channels it into a highly productive military rivalry.
It provided a localized focus for their aggression. The resentment they might have felt toward the state was just eclipsed by the desire to outperform the men marching right next to them.
That's a masterful method of social control. And it simultaneously increases combat effectiveness.
Exactly. But, building a massive, fiercely competitive army of drafted commoners is only the first step. Leading it requires a dedicated professional officer class.
Which is where things really start to shift in the sources. They indicate that over time, the Inca transitioned from a loose confederation of local peasant warriors into an army led by hardened professional commanders.
This transition was absolutely necessary as the empire expanded. You cannot run a complex logistical machine with part-time leaders.
Right.
So the selection process for these elite commanders was rigorous. It was tied to a major state festival known as the Warachiki.
And this was not just a ceremonial event, right? It wasn't just young nobles being handed a badge of rank.
No, it was an intense physical and psychological gauntlet.
The candidates had to demonstrate proficiency in foot racing over long distances, marksmanship with slings and spears, and engage in highly physical, simulated combat.
The physical demands were extreme, but they also faced severe endurance tests. Historical accounts describe one phase of the Huarachiku where candidates were required to stay awake for an entire week.
Now, I have to push back on this a little.
Yeah.
From a purely biological standpoint, staying awake for an entire week, especially while undergoing physical exertion, seems physically impossible.
It is definitely a stretch.
Right. A human being begins to experience heavy hallucinations and cognitive failure after just a few days of sleep deprivation. So was this purely a physical test that history has exaggerated, or was it designed to be a psychological breaking point?
It is highly likely the accounts of a full 7 days are somewhat symbolic or slightly exaggerated in the chronicles, but the mechanism behind the test is what really matters.
The psychological aspect.
Yes. Prolonged sleep deprivation fundamentally strips away a person's psychological defenses. It breaks down the ego.
And in the context of warfare, particularly the chaotic, close-quarters combat the Inca engaged in, a commander requires immense mental fortitude.
Exactly. By pushing these young candidates to their absolute cognitive and psychological limits, the state was testing their ability to follow orders.
to maintain discipline when their bodies were screaming for relief. It is a filtering mechanism.
If you can survive that level of exhaustion without breaking rank or losing your composure, you can probably maintain discipline when an enemy force is bearing down on your flank.
That makes perfect sense. And those who passed this gauntlet entered into an elite, privileged class.
The most capable among them were selected for the Imperial Guard.
This was the personal protective force for the emperor, the Sapa Inca, right?
Yes. This guard consisted of 10,000 elite noble warriors, specifically drawn from the capital region of Cusco.
And they were visually distinct on the battlefield, too. The sources say they wore uniforms of black and white checkered tunics with a bright red triangle at the neck.
Very distinct.
I want to look at the incentives for these officers. Because once you pass the Huarachiku and enter this professional military caste, your life changes completely.
Oh, dramatically. The state took care of their every need.
Right, their housing was provided, their food was provided, and their clothing was paid for by the state. They were gifted high-status items like coca leaves, intricate jewelry, and even wives.
The strategic value of this cannot be overstated. By completely insulating the officer class from the economic anxieties of the commoners, the state created a fiercely loyal standing command structure.
They didn't have to worry about a bad harvest.
Or property disputes. Their wealth, their status, and their family's well-being were directly tied to the success of the Sapa Inca.
So they could reliably command hundreds of thousands of drafted Mita commoners because they were a separate entity entirely. Their loyalty was essentially purchased and guaranteed by the state apparatus.
They functioned as the central nervous system of the army, transmitting the will of the Sapa Inca down to the decimal squads.
But, you know, having a central nervous system and hundreds of thousands of drafted muscles means absolutely nothing if you cannot feed them or move them.
Logistics, the hardest part of war.
Moving 200,000 people across the Andes is a staggering problem, which brings us to the true backbone of the Inca military. The secret weapon was not a specific type of spear or a brilliant tactical maneuver. It was logistics.
The infrastructure required to project force across the Andes challenges modern understandings of pre-industrial statecraft.
It's just wild to think about.
The Inca road system, known as the Capacyan, was the physical artery of the empire. We are looking at a network that covered at least 23,000 kilometers of paved and cleared roads.
And this is not flat terrain. They are building roads across deep ravines and over massive mountain passes.
Up and down some of the steepest slopes on the continent.
Right. And to keep the army moving in a straight line, they engineered incredible suspension bridges. They wove cables out of ichu grass, sometimes as thick as a human torso, spanning gorges that would have otherwise required an army to detour for weeks.
And along this vast arterial network, they constructed a highly calculated system of supply. They built massive storehouses called colcas.
The engineering of these colcas is a testament to their understanding of the environment.
They were built on hillsides to utilize the natural flow of cold mountain air, essentially creating pre-industrial refrigeration units.
I am fascinated by the food they stored in these colcas. The sources highlight a specific staple freeze-dried potatoes called chuño.
Chuño was vital to the army's survival.
To understand how crucial this is, we have to look at the mechanics of making it. The Inca realized that the high-altitude environment provided a natural freeze-drying laboratory.
The climate up there is extreme. The days are intensely sunny, but the temperatures plummet below freezing at night.
So they would lay the potatoes out to freeze overnight. The next day, the sun would thaw them, and the people would physically trample the potatoes with their feet to squeeze out the moisture.
And they repeated this process for days until the potato was completely dehydrated.
The result is a food product that is virtually weightless, highly caloric, and can be stored in a colta for years without rotting.
So when an army on the march needed rations, they simply boiled the chuño in water, rehydrating it into a nutritious stew.
They also stored vast quantities of weapons, sandals, and textiles in these colcas, right? Ensuring a marching army did not have to carry all its supplies from the capital.
Exactly. They also built tambos. These were way stations or shelters situated every 20 to 30 kilometers along the Capacyan.
Which functioned as resting points for state officials.
And for the chasquis, the relay runners who provided the rapid communication network for the empire, but for the army itself, they constructed calancas.
Calancas. These were massive rectangular assembly halls or barracks.
Huge structures. Some were 17 meters long, while others stretched over 100 meters.
Capable of sheltering thousands of soldiers from the harsh Andean elements during a campaign. And when it came to holding territory, They built cucaras,
The defensive hillside fortresses.
built with concentric walls. They featured stone parapets, known as pircas, which provided a physical barrier to protect defenders from incoming projectiles while allowing them to fire down on attackers.
Now, the coordination of all this infrastructure, the colcas, the tambos, the calancas, required a vast administrative class.
Because they had to track everything?
The Inca administrators, known as Upanaku, managed this logistical empire without a written alphabet. They used quipos.
This is a concept we really need to explain carefully. A quipu is the device made of knotted strings. But it is not just a rudimentary counting tool.
No, it is a highly complex, tactile database.
Right.
A quipu consists of a main cord with numerous pendant cords hanging from it. The administrators recorded data using a base 10 positional system.
So the type of knot, the direction of the spin of the thread, the color of the cord, and the position of the knot on the cord all conveyed specific information.
So a specific knot high up on a blue string might represent hundreds of weapons, while a different knot lower down on a red string might represent tens of warriors.
The quipu allowed the administrators to calculate exact rations, track troop movements, and inventory the colcas across 23,000 kilometers with astonishing accuracy.
It was the administrative engine of the empire.
I want to paint a picture of this for you. Just think about standing on one of those ridges watching the Inca army on the march. It is not just soldiers walking in a neat, orderly line.
No, it's an entire ecosystem moving.
It is a massive, slow-moving, breathing city. You have the vanguard of elite warriors. You have the decimal squads of drafted mid-of farmers. You have massive herds of pack llamas carrying the supplies that could not be stored in the colcas.
And the camp followers.
Right, a cacophony of camp followers. Women marched with the army to cook the junio, to mend the tunics, and to serve as medics for the wounded. Young men under the age of 25, who were not yet eligible for combat duty, marched alongside as baggage carriers.
It is an entire mobile society dragging itself across a mountain range, which brings up a critical point about the operational speed of this ecosystem.
Yes, and this is where I have a significant question. Despite this vast, incredible infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the quipu accounting, the sources indicate the Inca army only moved about 15 to 20 kilometers a day.
It was a very slow crawl.
To put that in historical perspective, a Roman legion could move 30 kilometers a day, sometimes more. Why were the Inca, with all their logistical brilliance, moving so slowly?
Well, it comes down to the friction of the environment and the composition of the force. First, the altitude is an inescapable physical barrier.
Right. Marching at 3,000 or 4,000 meters limits how far a human body can push itself in a single day.
Second, the Inca possessed no wheeled vehicles and no draft animals like horses or oxen. Every pound of supply was carried on the back of a human or a llama.
And llamas have a strict carrying capacity.
And they require time to graze. You can't just push them all day. Finally, that massive logistical train you described, the cooks, the young baggage carriers, the herds, it acts as an anchor. The army can only move as fast as its slowest vital component.
But surely that slow pace gave their enemies ample time to prepare.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the slow pace of the army was actually a feature of their imperial strategy, not a bug.
How so?
The Inca were not usually engaging in rapid surprise blitzkriegs. The sheer presence of the infrastructure, the paved roads, the full storehouses, the massive calancas, was a psychological weapon.
Ah, I see.
To a rebellious valley or an unconquered chiefdom, watching a city of 200,000 people slowly, inevitably march toward them along roads built by the state was a physical manifestation of Inca supremacy.
It communicated that the reach of the state was inescapable. Speed was less important than the overwhelming projection of omnipotence.
Exactly.
So the physical movement of the army was heavily controlled, dictated by logistics and the harsh environment. But the timing of their movements, the exact moment they chose to strike, was governed by something much more ethereal.
Warfare for the Inca was not a secular activity separate from the rest of their worldview. It was deeply, inextricably tied to their cosmology.
And specifically to the agricultural cycle. Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about how a farmer tills a field. According to the sources, the Inca viewed warfare through an agricultural metaphor.
Yes, a very literal one.
When a farmer uses a tool to break the soil, they are violently disemboweling the earth to plant seeds so that new life can grow. The Inca applied this exact logic to the battlefield. The warrior sheds blood on the soil to ensure the empire's vitality and expansion.
The battlefield was quite literally a field to be cultivated with conquest. Blood was viewed as a vitalizing force.
That is such a heavy concept.
And this cosmological link dictated their operational scheduling. They did not just attack when the tactical situation was optimal, they attacked when the cosmos dictated it.
Like tracking the moon.
Yes, major military assaults were frequently scheduled to coincide with the full moon.
And the emperor himself, the Sapa Inca, was deeply involved in this cosmic timing. He would often personally participate in combat, but the sources point out he would only do so at a very specific astronomical moment.
The rise of Venus as the evening star?
Right. And the spiritual preparation for this moment was rigorous. Before the battle commenced, the troops didn't simply sharpen their weapons and rest. They fasted.
They waited in strict formation for Venus to become visible in the sky.
Only when the astronomical condition was met would they break their fast, feast, and pray. They also brought the divine onto the battlefield with them.
The armies were accompanied by ancestral deities known as Hanakori.
For example, they carried the physical stone representation of Manco Capac's mythical brother into the war zone.
They carried these sacred objects on litters, elevating them above the troops. They also brought the ruler's effigy double, called a huaki.
So the presence of these objects meant the ancestors were directly participating in the expansion of the empire.
Exactly. Furthermore, priests were embedded within the army. Their role was to cast spells against the enemy and to read auguries.
How do they read these auguries?
Commonly through animal sacrifice. They would sacrifice a llama and inspect the inflation of its lungs to predict the outcome of the battle.
Llama lungs.
Yes, if the lungs were full and healthy, it was a sign of cosmic favor and impending victory.
These cosmological beliefs dictated combat behavior in incredibly strict ways. For instance, the Inca heavily avoided fighting at night for religious reasons.
They didn't want to fight without the sun.
And waiting for Venus, or the full moon, to rise gave the warriors a profound sense of psychological and spiritual confidence. If you genuinely believe that the stars, the moon, and your ancestral gods have aligned to guarantee your victory, your morale is just unshakable.
The psychological fortification was immense. The soldiers fought with the conviction that the universe itself mandated their success.
But tactically, doesn't it create a massive vulnerability? I mean, it makes their operational timetable entirely predictable.
It does.
If you are a rival commander and you know the Inca will not attack at night, and you know they are waiting for Venus to appear on the horizon, you know exactly when the blow is going to land. You can position your troops, rest your men, and brace for impact.
That is a valid tactical critique from a modern perspective. However, against most localized Andean chiefdoms, the sheer scale and the psychological terror of the Inca approach vastly outweighed any disadvantage of predictability.
Knowing a storm is coming does not mean you can stop it.
Precisely. Because once the auguries were read, the lungs were inspected, and Venus had risen in the sky, the spiritual preparation ended, the fasting was over, and the brutal reality of physical combat began.
The opening move of any Inca engagement was almost always a massive show of force, right?
They preferred not to fight if they didn't have to. Deploying an army of 70,000 to 250,000 men on the ridges surrounding a valley was frequently enough to force a peaceful surrender.
It's the ultimate diplomatic tool. Submit and join the Mida, or face annihilation.
But if the enemy refused to submit, the Inca initiated the next phase of psychological warfare. The troops would advance in absolute disciplined silence.
I want you to really consider how unnerving that sensory experience would be. We are used to armies screaming, banging shields, working themselves into a frenzy. But here you have 100,000 men moving in unison across a rocky slope without a single voice being raised.
The discipline required to maintain that silence is terrifying.
And then, right before the lines clash, they weaponize sound. The silence is suddenly broken by an ear-splitting wall of noise.
They utilized contorns called pututas, which produced a deep booming sound that carried across the valleys.
They blew ceramic trumpets known as kiris, bone whistles, and beat massive drums, all accompanied by coordinated roaring battle songs.
The sensory shift from dead silence to a deafening roar would induce pure panic in an undisciplined enemy.
Once the engagement began, the physical tactics were highly organized, heavily reliant on that decimal command structure we discussed earlier.
The army typically divided into 3 primary maneuver groups. One group engaged in a direct frontal assault to pin the enemy in place, while the other 2 groups executed wide flanking or pincer movements.
To encircle and crush the enemy's flanks. They're also known to use feigned retreats, right?
Yes. The frontal assault group would suddenly break and run, drawing the enemy out of their defensive positions and stretching their lines, before the flanking groups collapsed the pincers on them.
The initial combat phase relied on ranged volleys to disrupt the enemy lines. They used heavy stones hurled from slings known as waraka, which could strike with devastating kinetic energy.
Alongside volleys of arrows and darts.
But the ranged phase was just a softening up. The primary phase of combat, where the battle was actually decided, was the melee.
They closed the distance using short spears, axes, and their most iconic weapon, the star-headed copper or bronze mace.
We have bioarchaeological evidence skeletons excavated from these battlefields that clearly show the vast majority of injuries sustained were severe blunt force trauma to the cranium and limbs.
To defend against these weapons, the Inca developed armor uniquely adapted to the Andean environment and the specific threats they faced.
But they did not use heavy metal breastplates.
Instead, they wore thick alpaca wool capes called yaquala.
Wool. Against weapons.
The wool was woven tightly enough that it was surprisingly effective at trapping incoming arrows and dampening the impact of sling stones.
Okay. Underneath, they wore thickly quilted cotton chest plates known as aquana kusma, and they carried wooden shields covered in hardened leather called huacuanca.
Some units also wore helmets made of tightly woven wood or metal.
I can see how thick quilted cotton and densely woven wool would be highly effective at catching a wooden arrow or softening the blow of a sling stone. But how effective could a cotton tunic really be against a warrior swinging a star-headed bronze mace with two hands?
The reality is it wasn't.
Right.
The armor was designed primarily to survive the ranged volleys so the soldier could reach the enemy lines. But you were highlighting the brutal nature of the melee. Once the lines crashed into each other, the overarching tactical formations, the highly organized decimal squads, and the pincer movements largely broke down.
So the battle devolved into highly individualized, close-quarters brawls. It becomes a massive scrum of one-on-one fights.
Precisely. And in that chaotic environment, combat was exceptionally lethal. The physics of a star-headed bronze mace swung with full kinetic force are designed to crush.
A padded cotton tunic or a leather shield will not stop the concussive force of that mace from caving in a skull or shattering a collarbone.
It was an environment of visceral, brutal, blunt force trauma.
When the dust finally settled, the pertutas stopped sounding, and the melee ended. The Inca were left with the reality of victory. But they didn't just loot the enemy camp, pack up their gear, and march back to Cusco.
No, the aftermath of the battle was the beginning of a much larger administrative process. They had to integrate the survivors into their vast empire.
The aftermath was highly calculated, wasn't it? And heavily dependent on how the defeated group had behaved.
Yes. Captured leaders who had stubbornly refused to submit or who had caused significant Inca casualties were frequently executed as a warning. The state was unforgiving toward rebellion.
If an ethnic group formally surrendered and then subsequently rebelled, the punishment was catastrophic, sometimes resulting in the complete annihilation or forced dispersal of that entire ethnic group.
But they didn't just rule through terror. They also used clemency as a deeply pragmatic weapon.
The sources show that releasing everyday prisoners of war, the common foot soldiers of the defeated enemy, was a standard tactic. They would release them and send them back to their villages.
It was a calculated move to build personal loyalty to the Inca state. By demonstrating absolute power on the battlefield and then demonstrating unexpected mercy in the aftermath, the Sapa Inca positioned himself as a benevolent, albeit terrifying father figure to the newly conquered peoples.
Because the ultimate goal was assimilation. They wanted to absorb these groups into the imperial machinery.
The defeated populations were forced to learn and adopt the Quechua language, which became the lingua franca of the empire.
They were allowed to keep their local gods, but they were forced to worship the Inca pantheon, particularly Inti, the sun god, as supreme.
This assimilation process was designed to gradually erase the distinct, independent identity of the conquered group and reforge them as subjects of the state.
So what does this all mean? When you look at the executions, the clemency, the language requirements, it shows the Inca were deeply pragmatic administrators.
Absolutely.
They understood a fundamental rule of empire. You cannot collect taxes from a graveyard. They did not want to rule over scorched earth. They wanted productive farmers to work the land. They wanted labor to fill the mid-draft, and they wanted bodies to fill the decimal squads for the next military campaign.
This raises an important question regarding imperial stability. If you are constantly absorbing conquered peoples who only a few years ago were trying to kill you, how do you keep an empire of 10 to 15 million subjugated people from constantly erupting into rebellion?
You cannot just leave a garrison in every valley. It would drain the military.
The Inca solved this through a massive forced demographic engineering program called the MITMA system.
This is a fascinating mechanism. Instead of leaving a conquered population in their ancestral homeland, where they know the terrain and have local support, the state physically relocates them.
The MITMA system involved moving entire communities across the empire. The state would take loyal settlers from the Andean heartland people who were deeply culturally integrated into the Inca system and relocate them into newly conquered, potentially unstable territories.
These loyalist settlers acted as a stabilizing force.
They monitored the local population, they modeled proper Inca behavior, and they taught the locals Inca methods of advanced metallurgy, terrace farming, and state administration.
It worked in reverse, too. If a newly conquered population proved particularly restive or rebellious, the state would uproot them.
They would march tens of thousands of people hundreds of miles away from their ancestral lands and resettle them in valleys surrounded by Inca loyalists.
The psychological impact of this displacement was profound. When you sever a community from its sacred geography, its ancestral shrines, and its familiar terrain, you severely diminish its capacity to organize a rebellion.
They are culturally and physically isolated, completely dependent on the state infrastructure to survive in their new environment.
It created a self-sustaining loop of imperial growth. The army expands the borders. The newly conquered people are drafted into the Mida. The Mida builds the roads and fills the ranks of the next army.
That army conquers more territory, and the MITMA system shuffles the populations to secure the gains.
It is a highly calibrated, relentless machine of expansion, assimilation, and open-field combat, and it worked flawlessly against other Andean chiefdoms for centuries.
It was a perfectly adapted system for the geopolitical realities of the Andes. But in 1532, this finely tuned machine collided with an entirely alien method of warfare, bringing about a catastrophic disruption.
In 1532, the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro arrived on the coast of South America. He brought with him a force of just 167 men.
To contextualize this, Pizarro arrives with fewer than 200 men to confront an empire that stretches for thousands of miles and routinely fields armies of 100,000 warriors.
167 against millions. On paper, it is a historical absurdity. But the timing of Pizarro's arrival was disastrous for the Inca.
The Spanish did not encounter the Inca Empire at the height of its stability. They encountered an empire bleeding out from self-inflicted wounds.
The Civil War.
Exactly. The empire was just beginning to recover from a massive, incredibly brutal civil war between two royal half-brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. The military leadership was fractured, veterans were dead, and the political alliances holding the empire together were deeply strained.
But there was a more insidious precursor to Pizarro's physical arrival.
Yes. European diseases, particularly smallpox, had swept down the continent from Central America years before Pizarro landed.
The indigenous population of the Americas had zero natural immunity to these pathogens.
The disease decimated the Inca population, wiping out local leaders, devastating the military ranks, and even killing the previous Sap-Inca, Huayna Capac, which is what triggered the Civil War in the first place.
The empire is politically fractured and biologically devastated. This brings us to the pivotal moment. The massacre of Catamarca. The victorious brother, the new emperor Atahualpa, is encamped near the town of Cajamarca with his army.
He agrees to meet the Spanish in the town's enclosed plaza.
He arrives with an entourage of 5,000 to 6,000 lightly armed warriors in attendance.
The Spanish are terrified, heavily outnumbered, and hiding in the buildings surrounding the plaza. When Atahualpa enters, the Spanish initiates the encounter using a very specific legal and religious normative discourse called the requerimiento.
The requerimiento. It is essentially a document read aloud in Spanish, a language Atahualpa obviously did not understand.
It demanded immediate submission to the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church.
If the indigenous leaders refused, the document legally absolved the Spanish of any guilt for the violence, slavery, and destruction that would subsequently follow.
It was a bureaucratic justification for conquest. When Atahualpa dismissed the demands, famously throwing a Bible or prayer book to the ground, the Spanish launched a surprise attack from the buildings.
Let's analyze the actual physical clash in that plaza. We established that 167 men defeating 5,000 or 6,000 warriors in a single engagement sounds mathematically impossible. The traditional narrative always points to the Spanish advantages of steel swords, steel armor, and horses.
And those are massive technological advantages.
But tactically, beyond just the metal, Why did the Inca lose this specific engagement so disastrously in a matter of hours?
The technological gap was significant, but the fatal flaw during this specific encounter was the rigidity of the Inca command structure when faced with a novel threat.
Because they led from the front.
Yes, in the Inca tradition of warfare, the Sapa Inca and the high-ranking generals led from the front to inspire their men. More importantly, they were often carried into the engagement on highly visible, elevated litters.
They made themselves the most obvious targets on the field.
Exactly what the Spanish recognized immediately. Pizarro directed his cavalry and his infantry to bypass the bulk of the warriors and drive directly toward the litters. They deliberately targeted the leadership.
And if we think back to how the army was organized, the strict decimal system, the reliance on the elite officer class, we see the vulnerability. The entire structure relies heavily on centralized top-down command.
The squad leaders looked to the generals looked to the Sapa Inca.
If you decapitate the apex of that pyramid, the whole structure shudders.
The death and capture of the leaders on those litters caused an immediate catastrophic collapse of troop cohesion. The troops did not know how to operate autonomously without their commanders.
Furthermore, the terrain of the encounter worked against them. The confined space of the walled plaza completely negated the Incas' overwhelming numerical advantage.
They could not execute their traditional flanking maneuvers or utilize their ranged sling volleys effectively.
When the Spanish cavalry charged into that confined space, the psychological shock of massive armored animals creatures the Inca had never seen before, trampling through the ranks, caused absolute panic.
And when it came down to the melee, the Inca short-range weapons failed them. A bronze star mace or a wooden club, designed to cause blunt trauma through padded cotton, is utterly ineffective against a steel breastplate or a steel helmet.
Meanwhile, Toledo steel swords easily sliced through the Yaquilla wool and the Aquana Kuzma cotton armor of the Inca.
It was a slaughter. Atahualpa was captured, held for a massive ransom of gold and silver, and eventually executed by the Spanish anyway. For many casual readers of history, the narrative ends there.
The emperor is dead, the Spanish have the capital, the empire falls.
But that is a massive oversimplification. The Inca military machine was heavily bruised, but it was remarkably resilient, and we see it rapidly evolve.
The Inca did not simply surrender their vast empire after Cajamarca. In 1536, a newly installed puppet ruler, Manco Inca, rebelled and laid siege to the capital city of Cusco, trapping the Spanish garrison inside.
He fielded an army estimated between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors.
This siege is where we see incredible, rapid adaptation. The indigenous population realized that their traditional methods were failing, and they shifted their tactics in real time. They did not just stubbornly keep swinging copper maces at steel armor.
They began scavenging the battlefield. They picked up captured Spanish swords, they put on Spanish steel helmets, and they used captured shields.
Mago Inca himself is recorded as having ridden a captured Spanish horse and wielding a European steel lance during engagements.
They absorbed the technology of their invaders, but they also reached into the arsenal of the other indigenous groups they had previously conquered. Realizing their traditional weapons were struggling against the cavalry, they adopted a weapon from southern tribes.
The bola.
The bola, yes.
The bola is a brilliantly simple mechanism. It consists of 3 heavy stones tied to interconnected ropes. A warrior spins the stones to build momentum and throws it at a target.
When the ropes make contact, the momentum causes the stones to rapidly wrap around whatever they hit. The Inca found this weapon highly effective against the Spanish.
A well-thrown bola could tangle the legs of a charging horse, bringing a heavily armored cavalryman crashing to the ground where he could be dealt with.
But even with these rapid adaptations, the physics of massive pitched battles still ultimately favored the Spanish. European firearms, crossbows, steel, and coordinated cavalry charges were simply too devastating in open-field combat.
So the Inca adapted again.
Recognizing that open-field warfare was no longer viable, the remaining Inca leadership and their most loyal forces retreated into the incredibly rugged, deeply forested terrain of Vilcabamba.
And they entirely changed the way they fought.
They abandoned the massive, rigid decimal formations. They abandoned the show of force. They shifted entirely to asymmetrical guerrilla warfare.
They utilized their intimate knowledge of the extreme Andean microterrains, the dense jungles, the narrow mountain passes, to launch ambushes, cut supply lines, and inflict constant casualties on Spanish expeditions.
They maintained this resistance state in Vilcabamba for another 40 years.
I want to reflect on the sheer adaptability required to make that shift. This is an army that, just a decade prior, engaged in a highly ritualized, heavily performative style of warfare.
They waited for Venus to rise.
Right. They consulted priests and examined llama lungs. They marched in dead silence before unleashing a wall of sound from conch shells. To go from that deeply ingrained cultural script to gritty, hit-and-run bush warfare, hiding in jungles and rolling boulders down on supply trains, requires a total conceptual shift in how a society defines war.
It represents the complete abandonment of their normative ideas of combat. The music, the dancing, the ancestral effigies carried on litters, all of the cosmological trappings were stripped away in the face of an existential threat.
It became a pure war of survival.
This adaptation demonstrates a brilliant, pragmatic military flexibility that heavily challenges the common historical narrative of a swift, easy European conquest. The Inca did not just melt away, they fought fiercely and effectively until the capture and execution of the last leader, Tupac Amaru, in 1572.
It is a profound historical journey. Over this deep dive, we have traced the evolution of the Inca military from its foundation as a local militia into a sprawling, continent-spanning machine.
We looked at the tightly organized decimal squads, fueled by the Mida draft and driven by the competitive duality of Hanan and Huron.
We saw the intense psychological trials of the officer class, the massive Pucara fortresses, the genius of the freeze-dried chunyu in the storehouses, and the cosmological rituals tied to the stars and the soil.
And finally, we witnessed the tragic but deeply resilient final decades of their guerrilla war against the Spanish.
They engineered an apparatus of state control, infrastructure, and logistical brilliance that remains unparalleled in pre-Columbian history. They solved problems of terrain and supply that would confound modern armies today.
Truly remarkable.
And here's a final thought to mull over as we close. Long after the Inca Empire officially fell, long after the last Sapa Inca was executed, their military infrastructure remained. The vast Capac-Yan road system, the stone foundations of the hillside fortresses overlooking the valleys, and the ruins of the colcas storehouses outlasted the emperors who ordered them built. Consider how the very physical landscape of the Andes was permanently terraformed by the logistical needs of an army that no longer exists. It is a ghost army, but its footprints are still deeply permanently carved into the mountains today. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.